have a healthy disrespect for the status quo.
How important is curiosity to you in terms of what you would attribute to your success?
I've always liked to solve problems. I've always liked to build something better.
By being listed on the stock exchange, you actually create currency for yourselves to make acquisitions. Has at any stage there been a time when you go, oh my God, I wish I had never done the IPO?
So those pain points are the things that you have to bear in order to have the greater good. You sort of sail close to the edge, you look over the precipice, you realise I could be going badly here.
If you stuff it up, you're in big trouble.
I wanted to play in rock bands. I wanted to be a rock star.
Well, you are now in the financial markets.
Very indirect course.
Richard White, welcome to Going Public, mate. Now, we've never met before because you are one of our very big emerging great stories, great stories when it comes to tech on a global scale. So I just want to say straight up, I feel quite honoured to have you sitting here across the table from me.
I'm actually honoured to be here.
Thank you. Now, WiseTech, just tell me, first off, why is it called WiseTech Global? I mean, global bit I get, tech bit I get. What's Wise?
So there's a story here that starts when I founded the company in 1994. And I'd worked in logistics software a few years before that, building up what became WiseTech. The first name of the company was called Eagle Developments International.
Eagle
Developments International. Eagle, because I had an association with a gentleman in New Zealand whose name was Paul Hawkins, and he had a product called Data Hawk. And I thought Eagle's better than Hawk, so Eagle. And then Data Developments was software development, and international, just a word that sounded good. That name existed right through until the company got into its second generation. That was 94 through till about 2006. We bought a company in Chicago as part of our global growth. We've always had some acquisition strategy running alongside the organic strategy. And that company had a product called CargoWise. And I didn't particularly like the name of the company because it was called Fountainhead, but the product I liked the name of. So in order to make it appear like the Americans had bought us, we called the company CargoWise EDI. EDI still made sense then because it was electronic data interchange. And so we had the name CargoWise. And the interesting thing was that a lot of people thought we were a logistics company because CargoWise sounds very logisticsy. And so you get about 100 requests a week for freight quotes. So by the time we went to 2011, I needed to explain to people three things. We are connected to this product called CargoWise, which we rebuilt completely and issued as a new product. We were a technology company and we were global. And that was partly to drive it towards a listing where I could explain the company properly. So Wise is CargoWise, technology company, global. And very rare that Australian tech companies are global. So I was trying to make a clear message for the market. That was as simple as it gets.
The decision-making that you went through was strategic. In other words, you wanted to look like an American company had taken over you, CargoWise.
We wrote the press release quite vaguely, so you could sort of read it either way.
It's very strategic.
Yes.
These things are very strategic.
Because nobody would think that an Australian company was a world leader until they were.
Yeah, so the strategy there was to try and put your competency on a world scale by convincing Australians that this was an American deal.
So it must be good. And bear in mind that we weren't selling to Australians. By that stage, we'd sold much of the Australian market, and we were really working in the US and Europe, and we needed to have a brand that people trusted. And so it felt good for a first couple of years. But then it sort of inverted. We became the brand, and it wasn't about the American nature of things. It was just the trust in the brand.
Before you were listed on the ASX, how did you fund the business?
By being profitable.
Yep.
On the very first year.
Again, that was a strategic decision you made.
It was probably more accidental than strategic at that time because I didn't even know how to raise money. I just knew how to run but by the way, WiseTech was my fifth business.
Fifth, yeah, right.
Yeah, so I had enough money from the previous business that I had pretty good startup capital.
So you had your own money to invest.
It was a pretty small amount. It wasn't millions by any means, but I had enough, and I had a lot of sweat equity because I wrote all the original software myself up until 93. And then I hired my now CTO, Brett, and we, together with Marie, who's my co-founder, and two other staff, basically built the company from our bootstraps. And I would go out and sell, I would do support, I would write code, Marie would keep the engineers working. And
you say this quite like you're riffing. It's like not a big deal. Like, well, what's your market cap now?
24 or 25 billion.
Billion. Okay, so right, that's pretty significant. So what year are we talking about that when you and your co-founder?
94.
Okay, so not
93, 94.
So go back to 1994. That period, it was a bit of a weird period in Australia. Paul Keating, I think, was a prime minister, and
we just had the recession we had to have.
Correct, that was the recession we had to have, and where interest rates were like 17% or something like that, and Keating lost the '96 election, and the Liberals got in, and the world changed a bit. So it was a pretty tough period.
It was.
Your background, well, you said you were developing the software. Were you a software developer, electrical engineer? What's the deal?
I started as a musician.
A musician?
Yeah.
Well, that's got a lot to do with software.
Well, surprisingly, it's the same sort of mathematically logical process. I was trained, and I had
as a musician.
Yeah.
Yep.
I wanted to play in rock bands. I wanted to be a rock star. But,
you are now. In the financial markets.
Very indirect course, but I got there eventually. I think what I realised quite quickly, my father was an engineer, and I spent a lot of time in his factory after school, and he taught me a lot of things about electricity and physics and so forth. And my grandparents were both entrepreneurial, and I worked in the catering, the function centre, originally washing dishes with a big, huge dishwashing machine at the age of 12.
At your grandparents' business?
Yeah, it's like right next to where I lived.
Yep.
Right? So I just walked across the pathway to my grandparents. And I would work on a Saturday and Friday night, earn some amount of money that I can't remember, and I don't know what I did with the money, but I remember feeling incredibly proud to be paid. And I think they did that quite deliberately to encourage me to be entrepreneurial. They taught me a lot of things. So I had this odd but very powerful mix. My mother was very salesy, and she taught me a lot about sales and relationships and communications.
I'm glad you said that. Sales is about relationships and communications. That's what sales is.
Yes, absolutely.
You can't make someone buy something, but you can get them to like you a lot and build a relationship and keep communicating. And if they want the product, they'll buy from you.
And the only other thing you can add to that is you can make them love the product as well. But that has to be a really good product then.
Yeah.
So you have to have great sales, but you ought to have a great product.
So you obviously had exposure to relationships and communication. You knew how to work hard because you'd been encouraged to do so. You had an entrepreneurial spirit in you. Your dad was an engineer, but you're a musician. How the hell did you get into building this software package?
So it's a series of partially accidental steps. So I decided as a musician, we were gigging around and we ran into people like Angus and Malcolm, AC/DC, and the Brewster brothers from the Angels and
Darryl Braithwaite. Say Darryl Braithwaite.
No, I never ran into Darryl Braithwaite. He didn't play guitar.
Ah, okay.
So I was very good friends with the guitarists because I could play guitar and I could show them things on the guitar. But sooner or later, I figured out that it wasn't a very good profession to feed yourself and pay the rent, and I wanted to be a responsible person. So I started a guitar repair business, which used my skills, but also my mechanical skills, things my father had taught me. That became a very successful business. It actually moved into town, was next to a really famous guitar store. I got lots of fantastic customers, including all those people I mentioned. And that business grew. But I realized as I grew that business that it was completely connected to my two hands, to my ability to play the guitar and to do physical things with the guitars, electrical and the physics of a guitar, which are quite complex. And as a guitarist, I can understand them better than most. So at the time, I was also starting to understand the beginnings of computing and electronics. And I just kind of taught myself enough. I bought what back then was called a microcomputer, and I started just doing things. My brother was going through an accounting degree, and he was living with me, and I bought him a computer, but he never used it. But I played with it relentlessly. Games first, and then I tried to figure out how it worked. And I taught myself to program, and I taught myself to interface the computer to other things, and I could make lights flash and so forth. And eventually, I moved from, I sold the guitar repair business very profitably, and then I started up a lighting business, which built lighting equipment for entertainment. So it's the same industry still, but now I'm a major lighting manufacturer.
As in light the stage up, for example?
Yeah, all sorts of clever lighting and control systems for lighting, electronics for lighting. That business got quite big. We moved 4 times. It's on an industrial scale. When you're manufacturing things, it becomes quite hard because you've got to fund the equipment, you've got to fund the staff, you've got to buy the materials, you've got to manufacture, you've got to hold stock. I learned a lot. I also learned how not to go bankrupt, because you sort of sail close to the edge, you look over the precipice and you realize I could be going badly here if I don't do the right thing, it could be a problem. Bear in mind, I'd never raised capital up until the time of the IPO. I merged that business with a very famous entertainment company called Jan's Electronics, which did all the concert productions and did all of a lot of nightclubs and theatres and all sorts of other things. And I became the R&D manager there. And as part of that, I had to build a computerized lighting control system. So I had to teach myself a lot. I taught myself electronics. I had some engineers to help me. Bear in mind, no degree. I just came out of high school and started in a band. And then I had to teach myself to develop the software. And I spent probably a year intensely focusing on how to build this thing, got it done. And suddenly I discovered that I built all these fine-grained skills in software and in hardware and in computing generally. That company had an offer to sell part of its business to an English public company, which they sold. And I said, well, since you're selling, how about I sell my shares too? And I'm going to go and build a computer company. So that was we're now on the third, that's the third business. So I go to the fourth business. I built a computer distributor, and it resold Unisys computers and Philips monitors and many other peripherals. And I learned a lot about computing and distribution, but I also learned that it's also very hard to scale a buy-sell business, because you've got to have a lot of capital to manage the stock, to manage the debtors ledger. You've got to pay your suppliers on time. It's the same problem: staff, capital, growth. I sold that business in 89, just before we had the recession we had to have, and started a consulting business. And I accidentally fell in with 2 customers that were in the freight forwarding industry, which is effectively logistics. And I started writing little systems for them, because they were trying to glue together these multiple small systems. It was very ugly sort of glue, but it was necessary because there was no comprehensive, complete system for them. So I started thinking, there's something missing from this industry. By 92, it was 89, by 92, I'd built enough of an idea that I started writing a comprehensive and complete front and back office system for freight forwarding. Now, this time I only had Australia in mind. My focus was what I knew and what I had seen from those customers, and it became quite successful. And by 94, we incorporated it separately, and it became the original company, which was WiseTech, but was originally called Eagle Developments International.
And did, in that process, I mean, you bootstrapped it yourself with your own savings, and you also, probably more importantly, you didn't need to raise capital because it was sort of profitable, in that it was whatever you were selling it for had a margin relative to what it cost you, and you obviously were in a position to fund whatever you needed to fund. That's the development period, because you're not carrying stock.
Well, the software companies have this interesting thing. You have a big sunk cost. You have no cost of goods.
Yeah. You don't have a cost, and you don't have to store it. You don't have a big factory. You don't have a big warehouse.
Correct.
But you got to sell it.
Correct.
You've got to distribute it. You've got to have the ability for people to adopt it. There's no point in having the best software in the world if no one wants to use it. So,
correct.
How did you strategize how you're going to get someone to adopt this thing that you built for yourself, by the way, or your own environment?
I built it for customers that I had as relationships with. And I was basically saying, if I build this, we can replace all those bits and pieces you're talking about with this system. And I then, at that time, also figured out that you could acquire other small competitors and amplify your growth by taking their customers onto the platform as well. So the very first acquisitions that WiseTech did were in 1994, 1996, and 1999. And they got us to about 80% of the Australian marketplace. There was an organic piece, very strong on sales, very good software, reasonably good salespeople, but the real key back then was the software was just different and better than anybody else's.
So well, that works in terms of your organics. In other words, organic growth. Obviously, you got to train your people up to be able to get them to tell the story, and to be able to convince. They've got to be good at, let's call it storytelling. I don't mean in a Hans Christian Andersen sense. I mean, proper storytelling about what the software does, why it's better than everybody else. Clearly, you've got to be able to deliver, and you've got to make sure it's not full of bugs and all that sort of stuff. But how important were the acquisitions for you? Because another way to grow is not just organically, but via acquisition. And I guess you went and just took out whatever. You said, I'm going to buy you for this price. I'm going to take out what you currently got, and I'm going to insert my system, my software. Was that
not quite as aggressively as that, but there's a smooth transition that you organise. So you do the data transfers, you make the path for the customer quite easy, and then you basically have to shut down, put this old system in maintenance mode, and propose the new software is much better, and you should go forward to it. And that was very successful.
And that often that's sort of people refer to as the word as migrating one system to another system, or onto one from one system to another system. What you're migrating is customers, but really a lot of data. And that, as you said, it could be that the way I described it earlier was a bit aggressive, because if you stuff it up, you're in big trouble relative to the customers. But
if you have the talented people from that company that you acquired, and you have the source base, and you know where their data architecture is, and you have a good understanding of the data architecture of yours, you can build a kind of a tool to do that migration very effectively. So we've always gone to automate things that other people have done manually. And one of the interesting things, if you've understood any sort of complex ERP type system, one of the difficulties is building a system that auto upgrades itself. So instead of having engineers, connect to the system and load the files and modify the database and everything, the very first system built in '94, because I'd been experienced with some software before, I saw all the bad problems, and so we built it so we simply release a new version. The system would take that up electronically, apply it to itself, upgrade all the files, and start again. And that became incredibly useful, because the industry that we're in was always going through quite big transitions of requirements.
So it's sometimes the tech industry absolutely enthralls me, because you've got all these people in there with these big brains, sort of making something sound very simple, which is actually usually fairly complex for most of us normal humans. And they tend to think things through, and I often wonder to myself, do they actually sort of draw up a big piece of architecture? Like, do they physically map it all out, or on a computer perhaps, but they actually draw it out in terms of a plan? How does it work?
My approach was usually data-driven design. So I'd look at the requirements for the customer, and some of this you do in your head because it's become second nature, but we'd take the requirements for the customer, or the industry more importantly, because it's really an industry software package, and you would then map that into a data architecture. So the shape of the database, the way that tables and columns and rows are formed, is fundamental to the design, and then you load the software on top of that to enable the database to match the human. There's a human interface required, but there's a database at the back end that's got to store things, and that connection between those two things was very important. I built that on a computerized tool, which we used for many, many years. And actually, the second generation of the software was a sort of a supercharged version of that early version. So we basically just took all the things we knew that we'd done right and all the things we knew we'd done wrong, this is in 2002, and built the second generation of the software by basically cleaning out all the mistakes and building a clean, modern, SQL type database, and then building the software on top of that.
So in terms of, I don't want to get
too technical.
Too technical, but I'm sort of getting there a little bit. But in terms of your stack of technologies, how do you go about the process of making choices and how everything gets stacked in? They all get stacked on top of each other, or have you just got one thing? You're not using anyone else's stuff, and you just got your own.
Oh
system.
No, you do use a modern database, and you use a modern language. We've been through in the core system. We've been through 3 different languages and 2 different databases, and many versions of the modern database. The bottom end is SQL based. The mid-tier is all C#, and the front end is pretty modern technology too. But when you acquire a lot of companies, you also pick up a lot of other things that aren't necessarily the same as your piece, and so this creates certain problems. And so you've got a very structured way of thinking about how you bring things back to simple, because ultimately simplicity makes it easy to run a business. You've got to have a very complex solution, but it's got to be built as simply as possible.
So you do your organic growth, you make some acquisitions, you got your product with lots of iterations as you go, and as you just said, as you acquire a business, you have to make alterations and changes, and there's legacy systems, etc. And then there's the process of transitioning into your system over time and migration, as we talked about earlier. And you did this for a number of years. Where was the point at which you said, and or your colleagues said, why don't we go raise some money in the public domain? And what was the purpose of it? Why did you decide to do that?
Well, the first part, keep in mind that we were either a little bit better than break even or quite profitable right up until the second generation product and the need to internationalize the business. The second generation.
What period's that? What were we talking about?
The business was incorporated in 1994.
Yeah.
In 2004, we released the second generation product.
10 years, yep.
Okay. It's an interesting thing because every release has been 10 years.
Right.
And at that time, I had enough capital in the company and cash in the company to bring a second version into existence. It was quite hard to do because it's a much bigger thing. We built it for a global market rather than an Australian marketplace. And I got to the end of mid-95 and I realised that I couldn't internationalise the company without having some cash behind us. And so I brought in two private investors, Charles Gibbon and Mike Gregg, still shareholders in the company. And they invested privately, a few $1 million each.
So you did a private round?
I did a private round. And they became, very impassioned shareholders and directors of the board. And I don't think there was any push at that stage to go public. It was really just, let's make the company great, let's build it. It became a much higher growth during the global financial crisis. We had a fantastic business model that drove sales really, really powerfully.
As in 8, 9, 10.
Yeah. At the beginning of 2008, I introduced a new model which we called on-demand periodic licensing, which meant you paid nothing up front for the software. We gave you the entire stack. You could use everything. And then as you used it, we charged you for the things you used.
Right.
So it got rid of the old capital model where you charge this huge fee up front and then a maintenance fee every year. We charge nothing up front and a fee for the usage of the software.
But it sort of made it look like more a royalty business, which is, people love that.
Yeah, and royalty businesses are much better for investors.
No, investors love royalty
annuities. Annuities.
They call annuities, but it's sort of like that. Same deal, because upfronts tend to get spent. Annuities sort of get a better valuation too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you have terminal dates and you have all sort of good discounts, and depending on how well you're growing, you get really good multiples. So it's actually a very good way to value a business in terms of for annuity. So, but if I could just go back to 2000 and I think 4 or 5.
4 was when we released the software. 5 is when we raised some capital.
Right. So then that was the 5 was an IPO or just a private rise?
Just a private rise.
Right. So when did you IPO?
April 11th, 2016.
16. Wow. So did you do any additional rounds after the 2005 private
1 year
ride?
before, we did a pre-IPO round with Fidelity and Smallco, which we raised $35 million.
Right. So maybe you just explain, when you go to raise this money from these investors, and at that stage, we're talking about sophisticated or professional investors. What are they expecting to hear? Are they expecting you to hear you say, look, we're raising this money for a specific reason. We're not going underwater. We're going to go and do this. Is that the story?
Well, don't forget, we were profitable.
Yep.
And we were pretty high growth. In 2015, when we did the pre-IPO round, we were able to say, we think that the company's going to be valued at this much on IPO, and we think we can give you a return guarantee. So we took the money on a guaranteed float price.
Right. So who makes the guarantee?
The company does to the investors.
The company does to the investors.
It's called a return guarantee.
Yeah, return guarantee. And of course, that's sort of
if it didn't work, I would have been more diluted than I was. As it worked out, we were almost spot on to the numbers.
So you go the decision then. So you've already decided you're going to do an IPO, but you need some money before you get to do the IPO. Did you need the money or didn't need the money?
No, the money was helpful in that we bought a number of countries. Bear in mind, we raised the money in 2005, and I used that money to buy the US business.
Right.
I had the CargoWise brand.
Right.
And that was the primary purpose of that money, to globalise the business. I needed salespeople, I needed marketing, I needed global capability.
Integration, etc. But
yes.
yeah, but that was the objective, what you told these two private investors.
Correct. And then in 2015, we told the pre-IPO investors that we would be taking the company public. And we had a very, very strong understanding of why we were going public as well.
What was that?
We started giving options to the staff in 2005 when we brought the private investors in. One of my very good staff and shareholders reminded me the other day that he got shares in 2005 on today's valuation of 7 cents.
Wow!
So the company's worth $70 a share now. So it's a fairly big return on investment. And I think the reason for listing a company, in my view, there is always three reasons. One is you need to give your staff a liquidity and valuation mechanism.
An ability to sell at a price that's good value.
Well, they need to be able to do that rather than have private sales, which is very hard to manage. And then you need to be able to create public trust in the company, and a public listing does, properly organised. You have a trustable company that the accounts are transparent, customers can rely upon you because you're public listed and so forth. And then you also have the ability to raise capital by using shares, or use the shares as cash.
Yep.
To buy further companies.
Yeah. So it gives you currency.
Gives us currency.
It gives us some currency. In other words, you want to go buy something, instead of having to spend cash or some combination of thereof, you can actually go to say to the vendor, look, we want to buy your business, but we'll give you shares in our company. That's what we mean by currency.
We might give them a third shares, a third cash, and a third some sort of earnout.
Yeah.
Say.
Yeah. So, but you create, by listing, by being listed on the stock exchange, you actually create currency for yourselves to make acquisitions. And I think that's really important. And I think a lot of people forget about that. They sort of overlook that. I mean, you could do it as a private company, but it's not as attractive.
You have this illiquidity discount in a private company, whereas in a public company, the market is the market.
Yeah, liquidity is the most important thing. So what we're talking about here is the ASX sort of listing on the stock exchange gives you liquidity, particularly for your staff, because you got some staff might say, look, I don't know, it's great, I bought it, got them at 7 cents an hour.
But you need to build a kitchen or buy a house, or
I want to
pay for their kids' education,
I just want to do something, and of course, this is their reward. So you get liquidity for staff, you get liquidity for every shareholder for that matter. Then you can, and by virtue of that liquidity, then you can create currency because it's liquid currencies, and you can go make acquisitions. And sometimes it's not because you don't want to spend cash, it's because you want them to sort of buy into the deal.
Yep,
the vendor. The vendor is part of it.
Well, I want them to feel ownership in the company. So giving them shares is quite an important thing too. And often those shares are escrowed for a period of time as well. Yep. They're not able to sell them immediately.
Can you explain that, please?
So an escrow means that the shares are held effectively in a form that can't be sold until the escrow period passes. So that person is really quite tightly bound to the company. But regardless of those escrows, most of the people that have had them still retain the shares.
In your case, yeah.
Well, not in my case, in the case of many of the staff.
Yep.
The people that we brought in 2006, when we bought the company that had the CargoWise brand, Lutz Ostermeyer, who's still a very good friend, he had shares in the company. He's retained 2/3 of all of his shares that he had, even after this many years. And because he said, what else can I do with the money? I couldn't put it anywhere else that would give me a better return. Yeah,
so then it comes back to how well the company's doing. And
yes.
And that's obviously got a lot to do with you and your team. And I mean, it doesn't always work out that way for everybody, mind you. But you've had like an unbelievable run.
I would say
not
that,
unbelievable. I say believable.
It's believable because it's true.
Yeah, it's true.
But it's also constructed. It's not something that happened accidentally.
Very strategic. You've been strategic about it. Has at any stage there been a time when you go, oh my God, I wish I had never done the IPO?
There's always, no is the answer, but there are always things you go, that's the cost of having a public company. Those things, those pain points are the things that you have to bear in order to have the greater good.
For example?
Oh, well, it's
personal life?
No, I think... the biggest thing that was problematic was we had a short attack in 2019. We were basically very junior, young company with a very strong belief in the future, but we didn't understand that sometimes you can take advantage of those early beginnings, and we got short attacked. But
short attack being your stock got shorted.
It was more than that. It was a very, very nasty short report. In fact, 14 short
I
reports.
remember reading about it. But
They accuse you of all sorts of fraudulent things,
yeah,
and of course,
in order to suit their purpose.
And indeed, they're making money off the words. But the fact is that the company, because it was always profitable, we just kept on focusing. We largely decided to ignore the shorts and just keep building the company and keep focusing on being profitable and cash generative. Eventually, all the stuff that people can say about you passes away, because when you are very cash generative, it's the easiest thing to prove.
Yeah.
You can't disbelieve cash balances and cash.
Yeah, that's interesting. Did you say you had 14 short reports?
Yeah, in 12 months.
By one mob or just by a lot of different mobs?
One did 5, but then a lot of the other shorts just copy them and they issue it in their own name, but they basically say the same things.
Yeah. Has it affected your personal life? I mean, do you think you operated in any way differently as the top guy in a ASX listed company as opposed to being in a more private environment?
No, I think it was just the nature of the beast, and we learned a few things. I think you can say every day's a school day, so we learned a lot along the way. And I think one of the ways of looking at this is that you learn where the defensive points need to be, and you need to how you need to speak to the market and what sort of openness you need to have. But it was an unfortunate matter, but it taught me a lot about focusing on the important things and ignoring the noise. It was all noise in the end because there was nothing wrong with the company, and we just needed to keep moving on our strategy and really focus on the mission.
How important is it for someone like you and or your maybe head of investor relations, if you have one, to make sure that you talk to your larger shareholders in an IPO situation or in a listed situation?
It's very important to communicate to the market, which means at times it means talking to all of your major shareholders. But also, I think one of the really good ethoses that I have and the company has is that we don't leave anybody behind. We communicate digitally very well. And so everything we give to our half-year and full-year report at our annual general meeting is content-led and reusable multiple times. So almost everything that we put into some form of content. In fact, the company has these mantras, and there's a wonderful credo on the website if people want to read it, and there's mantras underneath that. One of the mantras is lead with content. That means leadership means you have to generate content to show where we're going, and lead means go first with content. So that allows us to scale the business massively bigger and better than you would if you were doing it narrative and you were having face-to-face meetings and talking a lot. The content-led idea amplifies our ability to execute.
I guess probably what you're sort of saying there is you're not so interested in having to abide by the continuous disclosure rules, which is something you have to do when you're a public company, particularly if you're ASX listed. By doing what you're doing, you actually do the mandatory stuff, the obligatory stuff, the stuff you're legally obliged to, the regulatory stuff, but you do it even more so. So you actually make it deeper and wider in terms of the content.
And it's not just, yes, that's true. First of all, you absolutely must comply with continuous disclosure. Secondly, you've got to do that in a sophisticated way. You can't just sort of treat it trivially. Thirdly, those things are also beneficial for customers and investors to know, and staff need to know things as well. Now, what you tell staff is a little bit more detailed and not so much about continuous disclosure, but about the knowledge and vision and strategy and tactics and execution components that you need for your staff to have so that they can own the growth of the company too.
It's really important to take staff through this process. And you've been talking sort of to me today, and I really appreciate your honesty and your frankness in this regard. But what about Richard himself? Has your life changed? I mean, obviously, you're a very wealthy guy. You've been extraordinarily successful. Your business is well known around Australia and around the world, for that matter. You're in a rising tide, tech that is. But how's your life changed?
Well, I think, funnily enough, first of all, I try to remain very grounded, and you've got to, you eat one meal at a time and live in one house and drive one car, and you touch wood. You've got to remain sane and focused on the things that matter. But I've always liked to solve problems. I've always liked to fix things. I've always liked to build something that's better. And WiseTech gives me that on a global scale, and lots and lots of the people around me are like that as well. Engineers are like that. I mean, I do have actually a degree in, I have a master's in management, IT management, and I have a doctorate in technology because I've sort of pulled it along the way. But all those things happened because of WiseTech, because I needed to have the skills and to generate the capabilities that we needed.
You still playing your guitar?
Absolutely.
So if I can I have one question for you, one more question, and it's slightly off the topic, but I heard you live in a very unusual bit of real estate.
Yeah.
Can you explain that to me?
So I grew up in Bexley, effectively in a.
I know where it is. I grew it off after me.
Really? Where was that? Oh, well, there you go.
It's the drive through Bexley to get to Cronulla. Anyway, go on. Sorry, your story.
So my grandfather and grandmother ran a function centre,
which you talked about earlier, which you worked at.
I did, and I at the age of 12, I was running the dishwashing machine, which was huge, and I was quite small at the age of 12. But I think they were really teaching me about work, the value of work and heart, and what to do with entrepreneurship and management. And I saw a lot of things, and I grew through that process, worked in the kitchen, worked behind the bar at the age of 14, probably illegally, serving alcohol, worked as a waiter, then I sold receptions, and I learned all of that. I went to Sydney Technical High School, which was about 300 metres from the front door of my father's factory, and I would walk outside the school and go to my father's factory every day after school, and he would teach me all sorts of stuff, engineering, electrical. He was a good engineer as well. And my mother also had these wonderful communications and sales skills. And so I had this great environment of
blessed
picking all these things up. I also, played the guitar and read a lot of science fiction. So I had a very active mind. My mother fed that pretty strongly. But the property was the property where the function centre was, and it had a few other houses on it. I lived in the back of the property in one of the houses. I started my first business, the guitar repair business, in one of the units, and I started my second business, which was the lighting business, in that property as well. So I was very attached to the property. I went to Bexley Primary School, Sydney Technical High, lived there until I was, 34 or something. And when my grandfather passed, it was sold. And I bought it back in 2014, but I bought it back with the desire to make it into something beautiful again, because it had become dilapidated over the years. And one of the things I did was make the whole place off the grid by putting in a major battery installation and major solar, and building a number of townhouses at the back, and building a very large basement with a recording studio in it. So I've got a decent sized recording studio and a place to put all my guitars.
So you bought back the family farm, effectively.
I bought back the family farm.
But turned into a tech hub, by the sound of it. So what have we got? We've got solar panels, batteries, and
it's a Tesla power pack, which is 235 kilowatt.
235 kilowatt
battery.
So normally, I just bought
power
one.
pack's 13.5 power.
So that's a lot of panels.
It runs the entire. The plot's about an acre. There's nine dwellings on the plot, because I built 6 more. That's for friends and family. And my friend he was 17, I was 18, met in a guitar store in Arncliffe, and we've been friends ever since. He looks after the grounds. My mother, who's just turned 90,
she's there.
She lives there in one of the units, and I've got my investment office there, and I've got a couple of units for my kids, and the main house is for me with the studio in it and so forth. But I built it to be off the grid.
Why? Why is that?
So I think when you are going to do things like environmental ESG, you have to understand it. You can't just sort of hand it to consultants. I'm one of my great things is I don't like doing things unless I understand them. I don't want to delegate to somebody and then figure out, I don't really know what they're doing or why they're doing it. So I thought, this is in 2017 when we were doing the build, I thought, I'm going to put solar on. I'm going to understand what it's like to be off the grid and what's like to be effectively carbon neutral. And so I had to scour around to find somebody that actually understood what the hell I was talking about, because most of the solar companies went, no, you can't do that. That's impossible. But I found a commercial company that did it, Smart Commercial Solar. They've done a great job. We've got something like 160 kilowatts on the roofs, and the battery will run the entire place for 99% of the year. And we output to the grid about 40 megawatts a year, and we use internally about 60 megawatts a year.
Wow, so you're putting back.
We're actually carbon negative.
Yep.
And that gave me a really good understanding of what to do with WiseTech, because I took that idea and said, well, we can actually amplify that and get WiseTech to a much better situation. You need energy reliability in today's world because the grid is becoming more and more fragile.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer. Like security of energy is a big deal.
Absolutely.
At our individual levels, and it's up to us to do it.
Well, think about a technology company that requires the energy to keep its customers live.
Yeah,
you can't go offline. You
totally
have to have energy reliability. So you can't just depend upon the grid to do it. You've got to have a backup plan and a backup plan of the backup.
Your backup plan probably is the grid. So in other words, something goes wrong with the solar or the batteries, then you can actually probably tap into the grid and just keep it running.
It's never happened, but
I get it. But
it could fall back to the grid. Yes, it's still connected to the grid.
Yeah.
It's still output to the grid.
Well, obviously you're pushing back into the grid anyway. But you strike me as a curious person.
Very curious.
Then takes a curiosity to actually learning about a topic strategically, though. Like absolutely learning about the topic, and then obviously you got to execute. How important is curiosity to you in terms of what you would attribute to you as your success?
I think being curious and wanting to understand why things are working a certain way is enormously powerful and really a fundamental driver of knowledge. If you're curious and you care to push yourself, you'll learn things. I also have this other characteristic, which I'm going to tell you about, which I think is, I've tried to analyze my own personality by like introspection and thinking
self-reflection.
About self-reflection. I have this concept called a healthy disrespect for the status quo. That means I see things and I go, that isn't really very good. We can do better than that. Surely there's a better way than doing that way. And so this has infected all of the thinking in the business, including much of the automation we do, which improves things, much of the way we build software. I did my management thesis on agile software development. It's been hugely powerful to drive the company. We've constantly iterated and improved that design. And I challenge people. I ask tough questions and I propose ideas. Why don't we do it this way? What about that? And that way of talking to engineers is very powerful because engineers really like the idea of having a challenge to solve. That's what their whole life is. Engineers like to fix things, like to build things.
I have had some experience with engineers. One of the things I notice is that they're obviously very logical people and mathematically inclined, but often they don't have curiosity, but if you give them a task, they'll resolve it. How do you, as the founder and CEO of the business, how do you impart your curiosity to everybody?
There's a number of layers to the answer to that. The first is we actually have an academy called the WiseTech Academy, which has lots of education on the industry that we serve, but also on the WiseTech way and how WiseTech operates, and training and technical skills for staff. We also have the credo that I mentioned before and a set of mantras. Another mantra is slower today, faster forever, meaning think about it, do it right. Don't rush it. Don't have to fix it later because you didn't do it well enough. Another good one is anyone can talk to anyone at any time for any reason. That's a very powerful one because it keeps the organization quite flat, but it also lets people spread ideas around and challenge ideas and say, I saw what you were doing there, but what about doing it this way? How about fixing that? And you've got to give people the ability to not feel threatened by proposing an alternative idea or challenging an idea as not being completely correct. And that's a powerful cultural thing as well.
Absolutely. Your culture that you're building in that regard, that is not only powerful, but that's really cool because tech companies got to be cool, by the way. But it is really cool because people feel, I hate the word, but it's a good word on this circumstance, empowered. They have the right to say something and not feel stupid and be heard at the same time.
So there's two things. We actually say enable and empower because enable means you've got the skills to do it. Empowered means you have the right to do it.
Yeah.
And those things are very important as well.
That's extraordinarily powerful. So I want to thank you for your honesty and your frankness and your insights, showing us what actually goes on in your head, which is a rare thing for people to get to. I'm actually quite surprised, to be frank with you, that you are so down to earth too, for someone, and you're still living in the old your grandparents' business back out there at Bexley. You haven't sort of got tickets on yourself. Remain grounded. Yet you could be, if you wanted to be, you could be some smart-ass tech head that sort of run around driving a Ferrari, something like that, and sort of carrying on. That is pretty cool.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate it. And frankly, I think the only way that you can really live a proper life is to be pretty down to earth. Because if you get too far up, you stop seeing the world the way it really is.
Absolutely. Really nice to meet you.
Thank you. Lovely to speak to you too.